Okay, I'd like to welcome you to another meeting of the Silicon Valley SIGGRAPH. This meeting is a special meeting because it's a joint meeting between us and the Bay Area Computer History Perspectives group. First of all, real quick official business. We changed the memberships to be a 12-month membership, so everybody should, on your newsletters, you'll get a little date at the top of the mailing label that says when your membership's going to expire. We've also decided to start experimenting with kind of a networking or just a session before the meeting where everybody can talk and get to know each other and meet people. And we're going to try this for a couple months and see how it works out. Please let us know if you like it or if you don't. And for those people who were part of the Bay Area SIGGRAPH, we've been supporting your membership basically as an honorary member for a year. So your membership will expire at the end of this year, and we would like to invite you to rejoin. I guess that's about it. We can start with the things that we came to see. John Peterson.
Good evening. From the late 60s up through the 1970s, the University of Utah was one of the focal points for the development of 3D graphics. Many of the techniques that are used today in things like scientific visualization to video games were developed there. More significantly, many of the people educated at the computer science department there who were doing computer graphics went on to contribute many advances in the field, direct significant research laboratories, and start businesses such as Silicon Graphics, Ashlar, Adobe, and Pixar, all of which are prominent here in the Bay Area. Tonight's panel grew out of a joint effort with the Bay Area Computer History Perspectives, as Dominic mentioned. Our speakers, all of whom studied at Utah, will reflect on their past experience at Utah and its effect on their later work, and also the Utah influence on computer graphics and the development overall. Each of them is going to give a brief talk, and show, some of them are going to show slides of film, and then afterwards we'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Let me get all of the speaker introductions out of the way quickly. I'll move, let's see, from your left to right. Dr. John Warnock developed one of the first algorithms for rendering 3D objects as his PhD thesis at Utah. He later worked at Evans and Sutherland. In 1978, he joined the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where he developed one of the precursors to today's page description languages. In 1982, he co-founded Adobe Systems Corporation, where he is currently the chairman and CEO. After finishing his studies at Utah, where he developed a method for curved surface and texture mapping, Ed Catmull was hired to start the computer graphics lab at the New York Institute of Technology. The lab at NYT produced many innovations in computer graphics and computer animation, and also served as a training ground for many creative people there. Dr. Catmull and several associates from NYT left to start a computer graphics lab at Lucasfilm, applying their techniques to feature film animation. In 1986, Dr. Catmull left Lucasfilm to start Pixar, where he's currently the chairman and chief executive. Frank Crow's PhD thesis at Utah provided a solution to the aliasing problem in computer graphics, otherwise known as the JAGGIES. After leaving Utah in 1975, he was a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. In 1979, he started teaching at Ohio State University, and then he switched from academia to industry, joining the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in 1982, where he led computer graphics research there. Since then, in 1991, he moved on to Apple, where he is currently a distinguished scientist and leader of the computer graphics lab at Apple's Advanced Technology Group. Finally, Lance Williams started at the University of Utah with a degree in English and Asian Studies, but he quickly came up to speed, and by the time he left, he was teaching animation there. He left to join Dr. Catmull at NYT, where he developed many innovative techniques for 3D graphics. After leaving NYT, he worked as an independent consultant. His clients included Henson Associates, creators of the Muppets. He joined Apple's Advanced Technology Group in 1989, where he's currently a research scientist working on computer animation. So, Dr. Warnock?
We're doing this thing in chronological order. I'm old, so I just... I actually brought and went to university as an undergraduate and got my degree in mathematics and my master's in mathematics And although my PhD is in engineering, it's a little known fact that I have never had a course in engineering. So it's a really weird thing, but it sort of tells you something about the kind of environment that Utah was. In 1966, Dave Evans came from Berkeley and really founded the computer science department at Utah. Prior to that, there was a single computer science professor, but he didn't have much of a department and he didn't have much of a vision, and so Dave came in, and with him he brought some ARPA money. And so he went back to ARPA and decided that he wanted to do man-machine interaction studies at Utah. And ARPA funded him to the tune of about $5 million, I think, a year, which was an extraordinary, or over a 3-year period, which was an extraordinary amount of money in the 66 time frame. With that money and with the start and the promise of doing great things, he recruited Ivan Sutherland and Tom Stockham and Bob Barton and a number of other professors to come from sort of the reaches around the country and come to Utah. And he sort of scraped up graduate students from all kinds of different places. I actually was working in the computer science department, or in the computer center, building registration systems for the University of Utah. And he got Alan Kay, and Alan Kay had dropped out of every school in the world and finally came to Utah to land. People like Jim Clark, William Newman, Martin Newell, Frank, Jim Blinn, Ed. The list goes on from the graduates from the University of Utah who have gone on to do things in graphics. The environment there was really interesting. It was a very electric environment. We were all very young. We didn't know what problems were hard and what problems weren't hard. And so we would all attack the hard problems and get results. And it was a time in history, I think, when all of us sort of fed off of each other's enthusiasm and invented a great deal of stuff over a very short period of time. Going from that group, the alumni who were at Utah, who ended up at Park, for instance, there was Patrick Baudelaire, there was Jim Curry, there was myself, William Newman, Alan Kay, who else? Frank, a whole list of people who ended up at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center who came out of Utah. Henry Fuchs went to go on in graphics down at the North Carolina, and is still very strong in the graphics community. The academics at Utah at that time were almost non-existent. It was almost a pure research environment where people tried to create things and tried to make things happen. The curriculum was almost non-existent in terms of there were classes and people took classes, but classes were not the main order of the day. Graduate students would come in and just try to do neat stuff. And during the early years, a great deal of that stuff happened. The number of people who were not, there were also not a large body of sort of professional students, in the sense that Alan Kay, as I said, had sort of dropped out of every college in the country. I had happened to flunk 9th grade algebra when I was a young man and came up through the mathematics rank, and the fact that I had no engineering background didn't cause the department any concern at all. They applied all my mathematics credits towards my PhD in computer science, and as I say, it's sort of unusual that I've never had a course in computer science. Jim Clark was a high school dropout. These were people that I think all of us as a category were people where Dave Evans recognized that somebody had a spark for imagination and creation and put a great deal of faith in us and really gave us the impetus to go and invent. And so we would put together equipment, and the hardware guys would get together with the software guys, and we'd go build programs and build stuff. Over the years, I think Utah has changed considerably, but in that period from 1968 to 1975 was a very, very productive period where a lot was learned and a lot of very productive stuff came out of it. A lot of the graphics folks moved on from Utah and went to Park, came to California, and in some sense, some scattered all over the country. But I look at it as a very fond experience and a very fulfilling experience. I don't have pictures today. I understand Frank has a lot of pictures to show you from that time frame. But I think everyone who was there at that time looks back on it very fondly and thinks of it as a very fulfilling, very gratifying experience where creativity was the name of the game, and that was your first priority and really your only priority. And it seemed to have worked out well. All of us seem to have done well at leaving Utah and going on with our careers in other areas. About 4 months or so ago, I got together with Alan Kay and Jim Clark at the University of Utah, and we were doing the same kind of reminiscing of what was different. And I think there was a peer-to-peer relationship between the professors and the students where we didn't think of the professors as professors and the professors didn't think the students as students. And it was really a working team that had a very, very good working relationship where we were all trying to teach each other stuff and learn from each other. And I haven't seen many universities that have been able to foster that kind of environment since then. And I think that great things happen when you get the right kind of support, where you get the right kind of interchange between people, and that kind of magic can happen. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Ed, and he can sort of give you his remembrances of what happened.
Actually, John remembers as a professor who didn't have much vision. That was my first computer science teacher, William Viavon. That's the same one, right?
Yes.
Okay. The interesting thing about this Fortran class, and I started at Utah as an undergraduate in '63, although I didn't take the first computer science class until a couple years after that, was that Viavon was actually anti-computer as the computer science professor. And so he would get up and lecture about how the computers were turning us into numbers. And I was an impressionable undergraduate, and he told us one of the things that was important for us to not do was to make sure we did not memorize our Social Security number. So for years I tried not to memorize it, but ultimately I have failed, so fortunately I'm a number nowadays. Actually, the way I learned programming was on the card punch systems on the UNIVAC 1108, where you could run a job twice a day. That's just the structure of the way they ran classes. And my great breakthrough was when I discovered that in the open shop, they'd neglected to prohibit students from using it there. And so I was able to run the account drawing for the class in one weekend, which screwed everybody else up, but I did learn Fortran over the weekend. Actually, while I was an undergraduate, I also took a class from John. I don't know if you even remember that, John, and one from Alan Kay. I don't remember a lot about Alan Kay's class, other than the fact that it was in the morning he was always late. He slept in. He was very exciting. I still don't remember what it is he talked about. The only thing I can remember from the class, other than being excited, was that I could shoot a rubber band farther than anybody else, because that's how we entertained ourselves while we were waiting for Alan to come in. As a graduate student, I came back, and the first course was one that was taught by Henri Garreau, somebody else, I think. This is our introduction. There was no textbook. They even told us things that were wrong. They said that the concept of anti-aliasing wasn't really there at the time. We had these jagged edges, and the way to get rid of them was just to make the pixels smaller and smaller. But in fact, nobody really knew at the time. So we didn't have enough experience under our belt to know what the real solutions were. And that was part of the discovery, was finding out what those things were. In the next quarter, it was taught by Ivan Sutherland and Ron Resch. They came in, they went like graduate students, which is what I thought they were. So they're halfway through the course. And so I was the one that had to blurt out and say, excuse me, could you tell us who you guys are? And that was my introduction to them. But they gave us an assignment, and the assignment was to produce a little movie. And we had two choices. We could write from scratch, or we could use this package that had been put together. And everybody that wrote from scratch stayed in computer graphics, and everybody used the package that was there, went on to something else. Actually, I'd like to show the results from that course project. So that's the videotape. It was originally done in 60mm film. But this was our class project. In my case, it was there was another graduate student who did the little title here. I digitized my left hand. I made a plaster of Paris mold in my left hand. Incidentally, I recommend that if any of you ever try this, that you shave the back of your hand first. So having digitized that, this is all very labor intensive, trying to figure out how these polygons fit together. And then coming up with a mechanism or language for manipulating it. There's the model. Now, this was actually covered with latex. It was put on top of the plaster. Unfortunately, the hand hasn't survived. Part of it was because over time latex turns into goo. Although I wish I had actually cleaned it off and kept the hand. Then we had this mechanical 3D digitizer and a mouse, a floor mouse. And then just went through this process. There was actually a fair amount of play in the mechanical device. Now, the little spots you see on there are that it turns out that when there's an interrupt, the beam would stop where it is, and I guess what gives the sparkling effect on the screen. Now, at this time, we were sort of making a big deal of smooth shading or not smooth shading because one of the graduate students, Henri Garreau, had just made this discovery of the smooth shading. In fact, Henri then made a trip around back to Europe, and he ran into Martin Newell, who had discovered the same thing, excuse me, they were about to try the same thing. So Henri explained to him why this wouldn't work, and explained all about mock bands, and so it actually, Martin delayed running experiments, and Henri rushed back and published what he had done. And this was shown at a computer graphics conference in Boston in 1973, I think. The little dropout polygons are twisted polygons, and the box didn't handle the bottom part of the polygon. This was done by another student in the class who again did something from scratch. This is Fred Park, who digitized his wife's face and then did linear interpolation between it. And he went on to have some lip sync with his face. And he was quite proud of the fact that his children did recognize their mother in this face. Okay, why don't we cut the videotape, please? I have to say there were several things about Utah which I think made it stand out. One of them was we had Tom Stockham there over image processing. Now, Tom was an expert in both 2D and in audio sound processing, and he was an integral part of this program. The interesting thing was that for years after that, image processing and computer graphics were kept very separate. But at Utah, they were together. It was I think one of the fundamental things that made Utah really jump out ahead, where somebody was thinking about some of these fundamental scientific issues involved. And I don't even understand to this day why other places didn't catch on to that, but somehow the magic of computer graphics propelled it off in one direction, and image processing went off in a different direction. Now today's people are more sophisticated about the overlap, but at that time it was one of the things that made us unique. Now, at the time I was a graduate student, also Ivan Sutherland and Dave Evans were off busy starting their company. So unlike the time just before us, when Dave and Ivan were there intimately involved, when I was there, they actually weren't there very much. What we did have was the funding, and we had this camaraderie with the students, and the realization that we were onto something big. I remember going to a SIDS conference. I don't remember where it was, but as we were going through the exhibit, I overheard two guys talking, and they were talking about Utah. And they were very disparaging about it, how what they were doing was wildly impractical and didn't have anything to do with the real world or whatever. And I thought it was great because I knew that we were off into something really big, and somehow these people were missing it. In fact, in computer science departments across the nation, computer graphics was not considered a legitimate area of research. It was an application. It was off to the side. There were interesting problems that they were involved with, and we were involved with too, having to do with languages and operating systems and data bases and so forth. But graphics wasn't legitimate. And even at the time a lot of us were graduating, universities weren't hiring people in graphics. They couldn't imagine what would happen when we were producing so much data that we needed other ways of being able to see and understand what they were working with. We felt good because the group of people there could see that and see that it was coming and that it was going to be important. Now, Ivan Sutherland was my advisor. Now, Ivan Sutherland, most of you probably don't know him, is a terribly smart person. And I am a fairly shy person. I was a very shy undergraduate. And frankly, Ivan, it was unintentional in part, he intimidated the hell out of me. I could hardly even talk to him. And he was so smart, and I was such a little computer graduate student. But I remember one of the highlights, and I doubt if Ivan even knows this, but it was when I first was working with texture mapping. And I explained it to Ivan. And Ivan said that he didn't see the value in it. And that actually made me feel great, because he's wrong. But of course, in the end, Ivan recognized that. But to me, it was part of this, the era that we were in, the smart students. We had the funding, and it was great, and we formed lifetime friendships out of that. Thank you very much.
Well, I came along a little later. I think John Warnock had already left Utah by the time I got there. And Ed was well established and became a very helpful colleague to me. But they both said a lot of nice things. However, one of the thing that I learned that perhaps almost first at Utah was that if you're going to give a talk, hide behind pictures. Then you won't have to worry so much about what you say. So I think there should be some slides up there with either my name on it or somebody else's that we can put up on the screen. I'd gotten very interested in computer graphics at the University of Wisconsin, where I was an undergraduate, and was poking around various places looking for ways to do it. And most places in the world were limited to making pictures something like this, using printers or even boxes or marks on graph paper or something else. Let's see, do I have a way of advancing the slides? Yes, I do. Let's have the next one, too. Next slide. So I thought maybe this is the way you had to do computer graphics. But then, next slide. Oh, I can do it myself. All right. Where do I point this? That works. At the same time, there are people trying to do analog computer graphics. This is I think Computer Image is the name of this outfit. This is a little box that puts together a little box, right? Actually, this box would be about the same size today for what they're trying to do. They take a TV raster, pull it apart into little bits, and put it back together in interesting ways. This is a diagram of what they do. But they take all these little pieces like this and grab the little pieces of the raster, reassemble them to make a character. At any rate, I saw this before I went to Utah, and that looked interesting too. But after reading a few papers from Utah, it became clear that the digital way of doing these things is going to be much better. So I went to Salt Lake City. And where there were beautiful people doing interesting things, and making wonderful pictures. This is one of Fong's pictures. It's actually John Warnock's model that he used to show how much better he'd done at making these pictures than John had. And here is Fong's improvement over what John had done. John didn't tell you that he was the first person to make a color picture at Utah. So he paved a lot of this road for us before I even got there. And here's an airplane that Fong made. So this was sort of the state of the art that I arrived to see at Utah. And it was very interesting indeed. And as Ed said before, the best thing we had there at the time, we had these two mentors, Dave Evans and Ivan Sutherland, but we didn't get to see them too often. It was really stimulating to go take a class from Ivan Sutherland, and if you were one of the favorite students, you got to see him every now and then. But the real interaction was the day-to-day interaction with the students. And I remember interacting very heavily with Lance and Ed and many of the others there all the time. We'd go out and eat together, and we'd discuss graphics 24 hours a day if we could. This is the equipment we had to work with. This is a PDP-10. I think it had all of 96K memory, 36-bit words, so it's a little more than you might think. But that sufficed for doing all we're doing. This is a time-sharing machine which served a community of something like 30 or 40 people. And we had a lot of fun with it. Here are a bunch of special peripherals that Ivan and Tom Stockham and others had put together. You can see a bunch of racks of equipment there, many of which were just high-quality digital analog converters that Tom Stockham had put together for his digital sound experiments. But that big box on the right with the blinking lights on the top was the Warnock, the Watkins box. That's the second time I've called it the Warnock box tonight. And this was one of the first real-time shaded picture systems. And we were discussing earlier that we still can't, with a $1,000 computer, do what this box could do back in 1971, although we probably will be able to in a couple of years. It made images that looked sort of real to some people, and it made them in real time. What was the plastic roll for? Lance, do you remember? That's a big roll of plastic.
Roll in case of fire. The sprinklers would go off and they would kill the computers.
Oh, so we had to cover everything,
The
right?
systems manager would unscroll the plastic.
That gives you an idea of the character of this place. That little blue box down at the very right was a little drum scanner for actually taking in photographs and measuring the light from them, things like that, the thing that you can buy from many companies these days. Now here's the panel a little more close up. The item that was most of interest to us is this this little item over here. It was a high-precision CRT scope back there with a camera mount on it. And what you could do with that thing is drive it directly through those digital analog converters and sweep a picture out very slowly. It would sometimes take, some of the pictures I made took over an hour. So to test a good testimony of the stability of this thing as it came out looking at all reasonable. And you just wait while the computer slowly scanned the picture out. And then at the end you'd have a photograph you could look at. John was talking at dinner about arguing with somebody about how he saw his first pictures. And I never saw one of my pictures on a computer display or CRT of any kind until years later, because they always came off very slowly. You could see the trace working very slowly down this oscilloscope, and you sat there and twiddled your thumbs for perhaps half an hour. And sometimes I got fairly good at looking at this trace to see whether I had a bug in the picture as it went by. But you didn't get to see your picture until actually oh, I have a pointer? Great. Didn't get to see your picture until after the film was developed. Luckily, we used Polaroid film, so I only had to wait about a minute, but nonetheless. That's an interesting picture. Well, let's try backing up. I think maybe we better stick our fingers in the tray up there. There we are. Here's some of the, this is actually a picture of some of the pictures that came off of that tube. Now all I have to do is figure out how this works. Push the pocket clip. There we are. Okay, so these are two color Polaroid prints taken off of that rig I showed you just a moment ago. One of these became a magazine cover a few months later. And this is another example. This was the showpiece in Fong's thesis of 1973, was it? And that picture, for those of you who like authenticity, this is the actual film that was exposed on that film.
What was the resolution?
Resolution of this one was 1,000 lines, I believe. That was the usual resolution we worked at. John started at 512. I think they were all set to do 1,000 by the time I was there. At any rate, this was, now, remember that picture looking at the rack of equipment before with the digital analog converters and the other gizmos on it. This is standing over by them looking back in the other direction. And we have a modest amount of hardware here that was brought by Ivan Sutherland. By the way, this little device was the input device that we all used, right? Some of you remember these things. This was an incredible luxury at the time, as a matter of fact. You could sit down to this thing and type in your program. You didn't have to go to some funny little machine that kept jamming cards and throwing bits of paper on the floor and so forth, and then take the result of that over to a desk where someone would snarl at you. You could actually just work with a machine, right? It wasn't hostile. But it was very interesting. You've developed very strong fingers, and that made a lot of racket. But all this equipment behind here was part of the real-time graphics display that Ivan started at Harvard, and I believe some of the stuff may have been wired up at Harvard, and then brought with him to Utah. Here's a better look at it. This is basically a graphics pipeline done in hardware, circa 1969. So it did the transforms, clipping, and so forth in order to produce a line drawing in real time on the screen. And it produced it on this screen here, and also produced it on some elaborate equipment inside the next room. It produced two video signals, which were sent out through these little cables up to little CRTs that were placed, high voltage CRTs that were placed almost intimate contact with your temples. And they in turn shown through mirrors and produced an image close enough so that you could see it in your eyes. And it had a little visor that you could flip up and look at the room while you're doing it, or flip the little visor down and see only the virtual image. All this equipment, I believe, came from Harvard with Ivan, didn't it, John? Yes. Yeah. Little did they know. Actually, one of the great things about Utah was that it took ARPA funding, which was designated for the military, and did wonderful things with it that didn't hurt anybody. Although that got them into some trouble later on. By the time I was there, they had to start justifying things in terms of more rational behavior. They couldn't do computer-aided choreography anymore, for instance.
We have essentially 20,000 volts.
We were brave men back then. Anyway, there was a very fancy mechanical encoder on top of this thing, so you wore this on your head, and and walked around, and all this gizmo here measured your position. At the same time, you could carry this little wand around, which was connected to the ceiling by 3 wires connected to shaft encoders upon which the wires rolled up, and those in turn could tell the position of this wand. So this came from Harvard. This was built by, actually the fellow occupied my desk before I did it as a grad student at Utah. And he did a little thing using the wand and the head-mounted display as his dissertation. Up here is an item I've never seen reproduced anywhere else. These are 2 3-foot ultrasonic microphones. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to a Spark tablet, a little gizmo that makes spark at the end of a pin and reads it along a couple of strip microphones. Well, this was a scaled up and 3D version of that. I think it worked once for about 10 minutes, but it was a lot of fun to think about and have around.
I think I was the inventor of more failed tablet devices than any other people.
As a matter of fact, even when we were there, every once in a while we'd get a little field trip over to Evans and Sutherland, and every time Ivan would have some fantastic tablet that he would show us. Some of which worked, right? At any rate, here was sort of the pièce de résistance that was made at the time I was there. This was specified and given out to a master machinist who built this beautiful device, which is now something you pay $5,000 for and sits in a little box on the top of your desk. This is a film recorder. Back here is a high-precision CRT, a mirror that can knock the image out to this 4x5 camera back, or send it straight down to the 16mm camera that has the largest motor I've ever seen for driving a camera back here to advance the frame. And it had controls for moving the camera back and forth and everything under the sun. And I remember the fellow who specified this had a long argument with almost all the other graduate students about what order the colors ought to appear here on the front panel. It didn't end up RGB. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, this was used to make films that Lance, are you planning on showing those later?
Well, we have some video, so diehards can stay for it, yes.
Right. So I believe that you'll actually see some things made on this device a little later. Then as things developed, memory got down to 2 cents and then 1 cent a bit, and it became practical to build frame buffers. And so this is the first Evans and Sutherland frame buffer here, set next to an Evans and Sutherland picture system. And we began to do things like paint programs on it. I believe one of the first applications for this, maybe the first, was a little paint program that Jim Blinn wrote. I believe this is Jim's. Is that right, Lance?
Gosh, I can't tell. I'll remember one too. I don't remember
Right.
what the color was.
There were 2 or 3 that appeared about the same time, so it's a little hard to say which one this was. But there was at least one of the computer operators, a fellow named Dwayne Palka, got into very quickly doing drawings with this gizmo. So here he was doing computer painting on the first active frame buffer ever used for that purpose.
From that slide, the tablet pen still had ballpoint ink in
That's right. Nobody ever changed the paper for some reason. I never figured that one out. But you can see he was sketching from this little medical illustration book and trying to put color into it. And we had a high-tech camera recorder here as well. Also, you notice we've moved another gigantic step forward in the input device here. Here's a close-up using a little system I made. This may be the first time hardware was used to do Z buffering, other than just in regular memory, although that doesn't make much sense either. This is just regular memory. It just happens to appear on the display. At any rate, this is a Z buffer down here, a 16-bit Z buffer, which is determining the order of the surfaces on this 8-bit display up here. And of course, it was hooked to a little design system that I did to design a surface over here. And all you had to do, as I remember, was push this little button and maybe type 50 or 60 commands on the console, and the picture would appear over there. Well, the interaction speed of this part of it was at real time, because this was a line drawing system and it worked, and it had hardware transforms and so forth, and worked quite quickly. Over here, there was a small number of minutes, maybe from 30 seconds to 3 minutes to get one of these pictures up. This was on a PDP-1145, I believe. And here's some examples from that system. Again, from the early Evans and Sutherland frame buffer. There's the Z buffer again. And I don't remember how I did this, as a matter of fact, but it's still basically these are distorted tubes of one kind or another. My first bananas. And then one of the great things about working in computer graphics at the time was that, as I think John mentioned, anything you did was interesting. So your bugs became works of art. And we had a lot of fun. This is some of the early stuff I did with anti-aliasing. I don't know how many of you remember Ron Resch's egg. Yes. This is the data that went into Ron Resch's egg, which I managed to squirrel away on a DEC tape, for anybody who remembers what those are. DEC tapes were little tapes about this big around, and they held, I don't know, 25K, was it? A few, maybe 50 yards of tape or something like that. Yeah, you probably can't read them anymore. But the nice thing about them was when you dropped them, they would roll away, leaving little reels of tape behind on the floor. Another picture of the egg. After I left Utah and Jim Blinn had done his bump mapping, the two of us helped a company called I out in Los Angeles for a while. This is one of the pictures that was made with Jim's bump mapping out there. And together, I think we essentially took this code. Actually, you remember the picture of the Fong's shaded goblet a little while ago. That same code was hauled out to Hollywood, fortified to make these pictures, and eventually became the basis for the first network flying logos. And so Utah technology went directly into the flying logo field, for which we had a year or two of fun, and then many years of regret ever since. With that, I think I'll hand it off to Lance. Thank you.
Frank's strategy of talking over pictures is one with which I wholeheartedly concur. Unfortunately, however, my pictures are not in the form of slides, and hence, if you'd like to see them, you'll have to accost me after the talk. And that forces me to kind of resort to my memories and to what textual remnants I have from the University of Utah. It was, as these other speakers have said, an extraordinary place. It was also an extraordinary time. This field was just a borning when I got there at 1972, or at least some of the initial birth pangs were already over, but there was still a lot of undiscovered territory, and it was extremely exciting. When a field is new like this, novel results are maybe a little easier to come by than they are in other areas which have been beaten to death, and I think that was part of the exultation that the students there felt. For me, it was quite an effort even to be admitted to the University of Utah. I had an undergraduate degree in English and Asian Studies, as John said. I had the good fortune to enroll in a summer workshop called the Institute for Humanistic Computation. It was sponsored by the NSF in 1972, and the fellow who was engaged to teach computer techniques to folks in the humanities was a fellow named Jef Raskin, who later went on to design the Macintosh at Apple. Jef, among his many remarkable personal qualities, had an extraordinary ability to teach. I think that he could have, in fact, taught programming to a chimpanzee. And he had several in the course, one of whom I will switch. We also enjoyed the, at that time, kind of novel technology of time sharing, and we learned programming by typing directly to a computer, and we even had facilities beyond those illustrated at Utah, instead of teletypes, we had little CRT terminals that were quiet and kind of glowed at you. And, Jef, as a pedantic measure, wrote a little language called flow, which could be translated directly from a flow chart. And it was really a wonderful way to learn programming. We could type our programs in, and if they didn't work, we could change them, and it was an interpreter, so we just to keep trying until things worked, which may lead to some bad habits, I suppose, but it was certainly a way of communicating programming to people who otherwise, I don't think, would have fallen sway to its charm. Jef said at the time that he thought if anybody was going to make animated movies using computers, that it would be Ivan Sutherland, who was at the University of Utah. And this opinion was shortly reinforced by a Scientific American article that appeared with some synthetic three-dimensional objects on the cover. And the whole idea that these pictures were synthesized from an abstract description of some sort, and that the whole scene was concocted from nothing more than the idea of light and its interaction with material surfaces was completely fascinating to me. And I applied to the University of Utah and also to Ohio State University and the University of Illinois at Carbondale, where Bill Fetter was doing some work with an anthropometric model that the Air Force had developed to do ergonomics on pilot studies. At Ohio State, Charles Surrey at that time was making pen plotter drawings of hummingbirds. But I lacked the perspective and the critical faculties to understand the differences in these different approaches to computer graphics and animation. So I credit it to nothing other than luck that I wound up at the University of Utah, where I enjoyed a most extraordinary education. As I was browsing through my Utah materials, mainly to look for pictures, which unfortunately I can't show you, I found a piece of text that sort of fascinated me. It was run off on a Xerox graphics printer, the XGP. Now, Gary Starkweather has told me that my memory is wrong, and the XGP at Utah must have had a laser beam in it. But my memory was that it was a line CRT that exposed the drum. Wow, holy cow. It anyway was a remarkable gadget. It was way better than a teletype. And if none of you have ever worked with a teletype, not only are those keys hard to punch, but those things are incredibly noisy. It's just amazing just to sort of think back to the bullpen full of graduate students all wailing away on these machines and making a racket like you might imagine in a factory of some kind. Well, this curious document that I found among my effects is called Williams Raps.doc 1. And it appears to be a collection of ideas about computer animation. And I think that these ideas were sort of floating around Utah at the time. I was surprised when I looked at the old computer animation reels that Jules Blumenthal was animating growing trees back at the University of Utah, which is something that he continued kind of throughout his subsequent graphics career. And I was surprised the degree to which kind of everything that I've done since I was at the University of Utah was predefined. So with your patience, I'm going to read this. I find the prose a little stilted now, but it's an interesting collection of ideas, and these were ideas that were humming around Utah and that I wrote down, and they were the ideas that I considered to be key in making computer animation a medium, and really making it practical to use computers to produce films. I left Utah in 1976. This document is not dated, but I think from internal evidence it's probably 1975. And I think that part of what I'm describing here is Ed Catmull's Z-buffer, an idea which I thought was just wonderful and still do. And the rest of it are a bunch of ideas about kind of getting information into the computer and getting it out in different ways suitable for filmmaking. So this is sort of a list, an enumerated list of things that I thought were important for computer animation. The first thing I wanted was a fast and completely general algorithm for determining the visible surfaces of three-dimensional objects, opaque and translucent, defined in terms of polygons, by cubic surface patches, general analytic surfaces, or any functions which can generate or be decomposed into fundamental picture units of color, brightness, and depth. A general algorithm should have provisions for shadows cast by objects and blurs induced by objects in motion. Should take pains to minimize the quantization effects inherent in storing and displaying pictures, and should provide feedback of contact or intersection among displayed objects to the object control system. So, we were thinking about motion blur. I remember walking into Ed Catmull's office with a copy of Ray Harryhausen's book on stop motion and saying, Ed, I just realized why all those dinosaur movies look so fakey. When we were kids, we thought they were fake looking, and we said they were fakey looking. And as much as we loved them, we thought there was something extraordinarily fake about those dinosaurs. And when I read Ray talking about how he took such pains to match the perspective of the camera lens to the model set, and the lighting, and the color, and the depth of field, and all this stuff, I was thinking, well, where did Ray go wrong? And where he went wrong was that his dinosaurs didn't move when the camera exposed them. When they opened the shutter and closed it again, the dinosaur was right there. And he didn't move there until the next frame. I had the good fortune to see once a sports film, The Tennis Match, which was shot under stroboscopic illumination. And it had the same problem as stop motion. People didn't move smoothly, they moved in. So later on, some folks at Pixar actually did something about this. In fact, Ed Catmull did some motion blur stuff at New York Tech that was really quite impressive in reducing these artifacts. 2, methods of mapping photographs onto the surfaces in terms of which display objects are defined, imparting color and texture limited only by the resolution of the display. Paren. Thus, NASA Earth photographs can be mapped onto a sphere, and Snow White is permitted a paisley dress. See, I was still thinking in terms of conventional animation, and it's not possible to paint paisleys on Snow White's dress by conventional techniques. Even if you had the time and money, it couldn't be done in a very convincing way. 3, general three-dimensional coordinate digitization. We saw the mechanical digitizer that Ed used to input his hand. I wanted something a little faster, a little less cumbersome. A system for this purpose has 2 principal aspects. Digitization of motion, tracking, where the interest is in recording motions to direct animation, tracing a path in space for the flight of a bird, digitizing the positions of the joints of a dancer at 30 frames per second. B, digitizing the surfaces of objects, where speed is not such a great consideration. A 3D scanner should output the color and coordinates of points on the surface of a model at the desired resolution. Combining A and B, digitizing color and position of surfaces in motion at high speeds and resolutions, is pushing the state of the art at this time. The most promising approach to this problem is automatic stereo correlation, which has been used to generate contour maps photogrammetrically. A color stereo film of the subject, Snow White dancing in a new dress, would be analyzed automatically. The stereo pair is correlated to find corresponding points whose XY positions in the 2 views yield the Z coordinates. Tricks inapplicable to photogrammetric cartography, such as projecting moire patterns on the subject or using a type A digitizer, that is a motion tracker, to generate fiducial points, simplifying or increasing the accuracy of stereo correlation, increase the feasibility of this method, which would still be rather time-consuming. I would argue, however, that that was possible even at the time. People had stereo photography, and if you had the money, you could correlate those frames individually and end up with a depth map on a frame-by-frame basis. Now the question would be, you'd like something a little faster and a good deal cheaper. Software support for 3D digitization must include information reduction and generalization of data, i.e., in the tracking case, classifying, smoothing, and interpolating between commonly used motions, walk cycles, for example. And in the object scanning case, reducing the object description to surface patches and their corresponding 2D photo mappings, which contain color and texture information. Well, I still agree with all this. I guess the surprising thing to me was that when Armin Brittelin and I worked on interpolating walk cycles last summer, I thought it was sort of like, oh, this is an interesting idea. But I guess that was on the menu in 1975. Computer-supported interactive design of objects and motions in 2 and 3 dimensions. This involves the fast manipulation of display objects, perhaps represented in simplified line drawing form. In the 3-dimensional case, motion digitization is necessary for input. For output, color CRT projection with cross-polarization stereo might be considered as an alternative to the head-mounted display system at the University of Utah. In fact, I discussed with Roy Keir at the time the idea of tracking the user's head and modifying the stereo display on a monitor accordingly. And this is widely used. It's something that Michael Deering has done at Xerox PARC. A guy named R.L. Diamond wrote it up for line drawing displays in a paper called Stereo for One-Eyed Guys. And I think that for the foreseeable future, this technology has a lot of advantages over head-mounted displays in resolution and the quality of display that you can impart. 5, an automatic rotoscope. The rotoscope was developed in the 1930s by pioneer animator Max Fleischer. Its object is to animate from life by projecting film frames onto a stand, where an animator can trace outlines of interest onto a cell. It was discovered that rough, wiggly outline artifacts of the tracing process were best removed by tracing only every 4th or 5th frame and sending these to an in-betweener. It is worth noting that Disney Studios have never been able to animate realistic human characters convincingly without resorting to the rotoscope. Snow White was animated in this way, as was Pinocchio's Good Fairy. When not rotoscoping directly, animators often use film studies to assist their understanding and rendering of motion. I profited enormously from the informal classes that were improvised with recently discovered subject matter at the University of Utah. And I remember Ed Catmull showing his animation class, Disney animation, frame by frame, on an analyst projector, and showing us that the tricks that the animators got away with had a lot to do with human perception and the kind of signal processing that Tom Stockton was teaching us about. Ed showed us that it's okay for an animated character to slide on the sidewalk in a cycle, as long as the sidewalk doesn't have high contrast lines or anything for the eye to register to. This was something that we verified by looking at some Disney animation frame by frame. It really works. An automatic rotoscope can be implemented with varying degrees of intelligence and dependence on the operator. One might, for example, extract image contours, stylize them with spline fits, and animate with arbitrary image distortion and color mapping. A more intelligent program could track features of interest and ignore others, permitting any film to be used as input rather than operating exclusively on specially prepared input films, in which figures and background can be marked and color-coded for the convenience of the program. This is another little somewhat surprising and embarrassing blast from the past, because I finally got around to tracking a human face and applying computer animation to a counterpart operating from the tracked data much later, just before I joined Apple in 1987. And I guess that was published as a SIGGRAPH paper in 1989. It's chastening to see it here. A tracking autorotoscope attempts to take advantage of frame-to-frame coherence to simplify the labors of the operator. Thus, an old movie, originally filmed in black and white, can be painted by a team of artists and refilmed in color. This is a manageable problem only if the program reduces very substantially the number of painted input frames necessary to color the entire movie. In fact, this has become a routine, if not terribly important, commercial technology. And the particular kind of intelligence that we use in the commercial systems for what they call colorizing films, I prefer the term coloring myself, is really pretty clever. The next level of sophistication is to track features and replace them with corresponding features of an appropriately defined character. Thus, a dance performed by Fred Astaire can be executed by Mickey Mouse. I think that's still a challenging problem. I think tracking unmarked characters in old films is something that either demands advances in machine vision or the cooperation of a human operator to intervene when the machine fails. The 3D case of the autorotoscope might follow the line of attack suggested in the motion tracking discussed previously using stereo correlation. The problems of correlating points in stereo pairs and correlating points in successive film frames are quite closely related, and the solution to these problems is the developmental springboard to 6, an automatic in-betweener. I meant something different than this, than you might imagine. This system performs the lowest level duties of conventional animation, eliminating the tasks of the in-betweeners, inkers, and painters. It would serve as an interface to conventional animation and might be used as a standalone system within the conventional animation industry. An ideal in-betweener should not depend on frame-to-frame correspondences indicated by the operator, although it may require occasional correction in this fashion. The general in-betweener should also not be dependent upon data in the convenient form generated by hand-entered input, but should operate on scanned pencil outline drawings or contours extracted from natural images. Well, these ideas about what an ideal in-betweener should do may have been an obstacle to realizing what a practical in-betweener could do at the time. This was a problem that Ed Catmull understood very well and pursued with great success with the Tween program at NYIT. These ideas of doing things automatically using kind of vision approaches, I think, are a little more practical to think about now than they were then. Attacking this problem should yield substantial rewards by way of enhancing the visual cortex of the machine. Artists in their usual fashion will hand the machine frames which bear no real correspondence, just to see the in-betweening generated. This should be particularly interesting when in-betweening the contours of natural images. The transition from one frame to another will not be another prosaic fade or jump cut. Well, I think to most of you here now, what I'm describing is basically morph. But this kind of morph, which is dependent on contour interpolation, was actually implemented by Garland Stern just a couple of years later at New York Tech in a system called GAS, which stood for Garland's Animation System. He would automatically contour images and apply some vision techniques to automatically create correspondences between the contours, and then he would interpolate the contours. And there's a morph between my face and Garland Stern's in his thesis film based on this kind of contour interpolation, which is sort of an interesting idea, even though it's not a very satisfactory morph. The final thing I mention is images directed by soundtracks and soundtracks generated by images. This is an important but not very coherent problem. Its solution involves many special purpose programs. The most important of these is a system to animate lip motions from a voice soundtrack. Other examples of soundtrack to image are fingers playing the piano and animated feet controlled by recorded footsteps or tap dancing. The most obvious case of image to soundtrack is the sound of colliding objects where their collision or intersection is detected by the visible surface algorithm. Well, all this stuff may be much more interesting to me than it is to you as an audience, but it says a lot about Utah to me, because I found reading this that I had essentially filled my life since the University of Utah with the ideas that I encountered there. And that's an extraordinary realization. What a place. It was really amazing. So I think I'll just leave it at that, and perhaps our panel will entertain questions. I have 15 minutes of student animation that was done at the University of Utah using incredibly primitive equipment, and all done on a 1/4 rather than 1 semester basis. So it's rather primitive animation, and certainly no threat to ILM. But for the diehards in the audience, we can screen that after the questions. Thank you.
Did was to read every one that came out, as it came out. But there was certainly no attempt to pass code from one person to another. That was a foreign idea, actually. Cooperation. We've probably all lived with that since.
That may be slightly exaggerated. There were a number of animation programs at Utah. Those that were principally used by students were Motion and Data Read, which Ed Catmull wrote. And those programs were extended and re-implemented in Bliss by Dwayne Palka and Garland Stern. And so there was a certain body of code that people did use and share.
Which problems at the time seemed insurmountable, and since been solved, which ones seemed as though they would be easy and turned out to be much harder than they were?
Everything was harder than we thought it was going to be. Now, actually, if you think about the list, a lot of those ideas were in the air, and it was really solving them and executing them. These are the nuances. A lot of things weren't obvious. Some of them, frankly, where the machines were so slow and the underlying compiler and system technology had to be solved first. And it took years for that to happen. And it would have happened independent of what happened with graphics. But once that happened, then it enabled a lot of other things that really weren't practical in PDP-10s or PDP-11s.
We were encouraged to think farther out. I remember Ivan coming around actually and telling us all about how excited he was that memory was down to a penny a bit. And that actually prompted me to give a little seminar about what would happen when it got down to a tenth of a bit, and then a hundredth of a cent a bit, and then a thousandth of a cent a bit. And so I was trying to propose some things sort of like expanded Z buffers back then. And somebody said, where are you going to get the money for this? Because you would have had to decommission the naval battleship and take all the resources for it to buy the memory at the time. So it seemed very far out, but we were encouraged to think that way.
I think that after you look back on history and see the problems, they all look easy. And the very first pictures that we made, for instance, all looked like all the objects were made out of film. And it felt like no one rocked why they all looked like they were made out of film. And if you went to books on color and started to study, all of the books were on analysis of color and not on synthesis. And I remember sitting in my office and looking at things and saying, wait a minute, the light coming out of this is not the color of the object, it's the specular component of the object. And I coded up in an afternoon the first pictures that had a specular component in them. And the very first pictures, I can remember everybody in the department just going ooh and ah because they'd never seen a colored picture come off the computer that had the depth and realism that this simple specular component gave. But it was sort of an invention process that once you knew the answer, it was obvious. It was obvious that you could take this in all different kinds of directions. But sort of getting the fundamental insight that this was something that needed to be thought about in a different way was sort of the excitement of the place. People would just come up with this, all the pictures were awful. Before that, now all the pictures look great. And now they started looking at the smooth shading breakthrough that Henry made. Was everybody thought it was the way to get smooth shading was to add more polygons. And I remember doing a sphere that had bazillions of polygons in it, and it still looked terrible. And Henry's first smooth shaded thing got rid of all of those artifacts in a billion computation. And so those kind of breakthroughs were really the excitement.
More like vision, some of the tracking and stuff. Progress in that doesn't seem to have been as rapid as it has been in graphics.
Part of that's because of the separation. At that time, we had people who were willing to think about that because of image processing right there. So it was a natural thing to think about that. And they split apart, which I think was unfortunate.
It really wasn't all that far-fetched because there were automatic tracking systems used by the military on a daily basis, and even at that time, in the early 70s, an outfit called Cellspot in Sweden was making real-time trackers for doing gate studies and so forth.
Can anybody explain just what it was about that teapot?
Well, it was sitting on Martin Newell's desk for a long time, and he and Jim Blinn needed a canonical object for the texture mapping tests they were going to do. And I went through this with Martin a few years back when we did the little article on the teapot for CG&A. And so Martin saw it there every day, got used to it, and finally decided to digitize it to some extent. And then they made a couple of pictures of it, but it didn't look right. So they squashed it. Martin's original teapot was a good deal taller than the model we're all used to. They decided that looked better. And so that's how the teapot came about. One of the problems with the teapot was that it didn't have any bottom in it originally. If you poured water in it, it would just fall out the bottom. But that was not of great concern to them.
Also, modeling was not the central problem for us at that time. And since we were worried about making pictures, it was far easier to grab somebody else's data.
Yeah, so models lasted a long time. Well, witness the teapot. I still use some of the models that I made at that time. Right?
Each of your respective to duplicate the University of Utah experience at the time of the late 60s and early 70s? Or is it all one of the 70s was an amazing thing in its own right.
Well, I think that's part of it. Is things like that do happen on occasion with different kinds of schools. There's partly luck with the right set of people at the right time. There's money and there's opportunity, and all those things came together at Utah and they just exploded. Park had a group of people and the funding behind it, and amazing things happened there. There are, I know, Cal Arts and animation. That's a preeminent school. The right collection of things happened, and industry spawned out of that. So the answer is yes, it is possible.
I think it happens all the time, both in industry and in schools. And I think part of the late 70s, at least for me, was extraordinary times of collaboration and work.
It does mean that you've got to provide an environment. I think you have to be conscious about it. Provide an environment for people and let them do something. I know some schools, very prominent schools, they have all the students work on a single software system or work on some project, or they're like assistants for the professor. Those places don't take off, generally.
I think the support, sort of psychological support for the student, and not, I can't ever remember a negative word about anything between the students and the professors. I mean, there was no putting down, or, I mean, everybody was sort of on a very up kind of attitude.
Except for Jim Park on the dirt.
Yes, there may have been isolated incidents.
Ivan was capable of the occasional acerbic word.
But I think it was a very supportive place. And Dave Evans, in particular, was an extraordinarily supportive instructor, teacher.
Right, they viewed their job as bringing people along. And as long as you think of yourself that way, then that comes out what you say to the students.
But also, Dave Evans had the great good taste to choose something that not a lot of people believed in at the time, but that he could see how it was possible to do. And it was also something that was going to be real interesting to grad students, no question about that. So there's certainly part of it. Not only were there good people there and the funding and so forth, but he also chose a good problem for the time. I think that's equally important.
At the time, I mean, just like the talks tonight, it's always pictures. Whenever you show pictures, you get oohs and ahs. And it was a very gratifying experience to go around to other universities and show them pictures, and here they were writing compilers. Gee, you get Kodak. And here these guys are doing pictures. It was very exciting. That aspect of it is always great.
I think at least one answer that we deserve to hear is Ed Emschler's answer to the rhetorical question, when was the golden age of science fiction? The answer is 8. One of the things that was really extraordinary about that time for us is, hey, we were all young then. We were having a good time.
So do it while you're young. Have any of us done that yet?
What was the relationship between Evans and Sutherland at the university? Was there much collaboration there? Or was it?
Dave continued to have minor activity. Ivan taught classes, but it cut pretty cleanly. And they were off doing their thing in graphics sort of students at the university.
A couple students worked, like Jim Park worked up there somewhat.
I had a fair amount of interaction with both of them because I started out with Ivan as my advisor, and he left before I was done, so then Dave Evans became my advisor. But I'm not sure I ever saw both of them in the same room at the same time. That had nothing to do with them disliking each other or anything like that. They just had jobs to do.
Were your display devices raster or vector? I know they started with vector technology.
Well, we had the very first vector display was built by IDI. So we had there was this beast to program. It was awful. Let me tell you how I made my pictures. We had a 32,000 word 1108 with 36-bit words that was in one room. And a cable came across to another room hooked to a PDP-8. The PDP-8 would throw V-to-A converters to a Hewlett-Packard oscilloscope with a P4000. exposed it with 3 sheets of cellophane in between that were red, green, and blue, I would get color. Well, the very first display we had a green phosphor on it, so I had to expose the red frame 10 times more than any other frame to get it to even resemble color. And it didn't really. And then we got a P4 phosphor from Hewlett Packard that was actually had white characteristics and could get reasonable color photographs out of it. But it was certainly a key punch edge process, sort of 5 minutes at a time to 10 minutes at a time to do it kind of activity. And modeling was mostly an analytic. Figure out what the perspective is going to be, learn how to set the numbers, put it in the first quadrant kind of activity where that's the way you build modeling, was by programming parametric equations to generate polygon.
And actually, after that, we built, or the school built, largely through Tom Stockton, a couple of other high-precision displays, and they were quite good for the time. But it was all scanning it like this. We also had a few early tectonic storage tubes. ARDS. I'm sorry, it's the ARDS display.
That's right. There's just one of them.
And then a couple of other. You may remember a long time ago, IBM decided to get into the computer graphics market. At that time, it really was too early, and it didn't work very well. But there were a few early pieces of equipment.
Grayscale was modulated by how long you left the beam on for a particular XY location. So that's it modulated the beam for a time period that would count down and move to leave the beam before it would move it to the next XY position.
There also were some, I think they were called Univac 1559s or something. There were little, there were workstations that could handle a very limited display list, and then draw the lines on the screen, and you could program those to run some very simple animations and things like that. Yeah, and that was really fancy stuff, right? I'd never seen anything like that when I arrived.
Well, actually, you need to have some professor, and Dave and Ivan were pretty much gone, and Martin Newell, who was a graduate student, turned into a professor, but I think he just sort of wore out and decided to go on to So basically, when Martin left, they took a hit. Now, there were still some students that came after that. You had Jim Blinn and later Brian Barsky came through. There's still a program, but the focus now is in CAD.
And the funding started to dribble away about that time, too. There was a thing called the Mansfield Amendment that said that the ARPA money had to be spent on defense and not on computer-aided choreography and art. And that began to focus things a little more, and at some point it really started to get cut off.
We failed to come up with a fatal cartoon, so nobody would fund us anymore.
Well, actually, during the 60s and early 70s, ARPA funded that group of ARPA IPT funded the most general. I never even saw a defense-related project with any of them. I mean, Multex at MIT was funded by ARPA. The ILIAC 4 project was funded by ARPA. The time-sharing systems that were done at Berkeley were funded by ARPA. And so you had this incredible diversity of projects, none of them defense-related. The ARPANET was certainly, I mean, it was never built as a defense project because it was an unsecure network. And it was a way for universities to collaborate. There was an interesting thing about research funding that I think is to be learned in this. NSF typically funds lots and lots and lots of small projects. You do a proposal, you get an NSF. ARPA decided to put great gobs of money in 25 centers of excellence, which they call 25 centers of excellence. And so they put very large funding blocks, which gave the institutions critical mass. They could buy equipment. They could give fellowships to graduate students. They could do all kinds of things to get the critical mass of development to the point. And then that fell off.
There's very low bureaucracy, and it essentially propelled the U.S. way ahead of the rest of the world in computer science. We just sort of take it for granted because we're Americans, but they just blasted us ahead of everybody else. It was really a great program.
The quarterly reports that ARPA required were like 3 funding that was used in extraordinarily creative ways. And I think it would be interesting to figure out how to recapture that kind of funding level out of the government, rather than trying to expect a single researcher with an NSF grant to try to do anything substantial with not enough money.
ARPA still has less bureaucracy than NSF, like considerable.
One of the kind of interesting things about the Utah program is that, for once, ARPA actually got their money's worth. Their stated aim in funding computer graphics research was the long-term goal of a real-time flight simulator that didn't involve motion control of cameras over models. And Evans and Sutherland delivered that. Gary Watkins delivered an algorithm that could be built in hardware that would supply those pictures to the screen. And, you know, maybe ARPA got some money back for their AI research, but they certainly got it for their graphics.
This is more comment than a question or maybe some vote. A lot of the things that you said were describing as that got funded that didn't have a military purpose. In fact, did have utility for the military, sort of the same sort of way. But technologies developed in doing the ARPANET were things that were very misunderstood yet. There was the LIAC-4 here, and that's a Haynes for many years. They cranked, among other things, performance numbers for military aircraft. So I think if people are willing to look long enough term, the consequences do come around. But how do you convince people to do that?
Recent administrations have not been able to do that. I agree with you completely. But I think recent administrations will do that.
And they just don't get it. It's fairly obvious to us because we're in an industry which was an amazing success. They built a scientific infrastructure which a lot of this economy is built on. And it worked.
Did any of you think you'd get rich when you met with students, or was it just the fun of it?
Having this stuff, God,
Sensitive factor, or not? You can think
Oh,
about it.
and I can't even think of anyone who figured out how we were going to get dean's leave.
It really was a labor of love. I don't think anybody had any notions about what they were going to do once they got done with their degrees.
There was no computer science deal. Universities weren't hiring graphics people.
Well, a number of us were under the delusion that computer graphics would promptly feature prominently in the motion picture business. And I don't know whether Ed's embarrassed to recall this or not, but he and I used to spend hours at a time talking about what we could do if we could just find some really rich sucker, you know, to spend a lot of money on computer graphics.
Ed and Lance, did you find much similarity between what happened at Utah and what happened at NYU?
Actually, fairly different experience. One of them was that New York Tech was funded by a private individual who was well off. And it was kind of awkward because we really did a lot there. I mean, a lot of great ideas came there, and there was another great group of people that came through. We didn't go to Utah, but I mean, there's just some extraordinary people were there. What makes it a little more awkward is that the person who funded it, unlike, say, the ARPA or school, he got nothing for this in the end because he didn't, a variety of reasons. He didn't have, I think, the business sense or the total sense of what he could do with it. So in the end, there was this funny thing where we had this great camaraderie, we did these great things, but always with the feeling that, you know, here was the rich guy that funded it, but he never really got his money's worth for it. There's always one of those strange things in the back, but a phenomenal place. And the one who's going to get rich off is the end of the business.
Another quiet
Thank you very much. If any more questions, quick, before I wrap this up? Okay.
Yeah, we have about 15
We
minutes
have
of
to
old
sort of like lay them
animation.
out on a table and everybody wander around. Oh yeah, we also have the animation, you're right. Another
I'd like
question.
to
Having attended the first, I think, SIGGRAPH conference at the University of Colorado in, was it 73? Is that right?
I wasn't there. That was in Boulder, right?
Yeah. And, you know, having gone to them more recently where there are 40,000 people in, you know, some venue somewhere, it seems to me that computer graphics has changed character dramatically from, say, the Utah days, the early SIGGRAPH days, to now, and it's...
We were poor and pure, and now we're rich and corrupt.
Well, just corrupt.
I don't know, anybody care
Or maybe old.
about the change of that? The romance is gone or something, I don't know, it's just a lot different now.
Well, I have to say one thing, though, because I've been active in SIGGRAPH throughout its time, and for a long time people have been saying it's lost its character. The fact is it has been changing. But to me, that's been an exciting community, too. I mean, it's been different all along. It started way back in the early conferences. You knew everybody up through now. And it is different every year, and there are definitely changes, but on the other hand, I have to say that's really been an exciting community. I mean, for me, it's been my professional community, through my adulthood.
Maybe a side question to that is, how much of the Utah experience was left brain and how much of it was right brain? And what is your sense now about the changing nature of SIGGRAPH, for example, and the kind of melding of the creative arts community with the technology now?
Well, I think the most exciting things we see at SIGGRAPH are still combinations of left brain and right brain activity, if I understand what you mean. Frankly, when you get too far one way or the other, I lose interest.
Well, I would say that at Utah it was almost all left brain. Witness the pictures and the film and the taste. I mean, they were sort of neat from a technical point of view, but they were not aesthetic works of art. And I think that the exciting part is actually to get right brain people who can deal with computers and work with them who have a very creative field. We've gotten user interfaces to the point where they can express their creativity through these tools. And I personally get a great kick out of it.
Actually, one of the things that made SIGGRAPH take off was in 1977, like when they had the conference in San Jose. And that was where they adopted this format, which was where they had tutorials, and they had the business sections, and the technical, and they had the film show, and put all those together. And it really was the combination that excited people and brought them in. And the people that were involved with it recognized it. That's what they were trying to do. It was really to involve both.
You know, as far as the aesthetics go, I think it's wrong to be critical of the aesthetics of early computer graphics because unlike a lot of other media, and I contrast it in particular with film or photography, computer graphics was a medium that was delivered piecemeal. It's as if, instead of photography being invented, 1 month they invent a machine that can take pictures of square objects. And, a year later they have a picture that can take, round objects or soft objects.
Aiming for the day when they can take pictures of photorealistic objects.
Aiming for the day when it looks just like a photograph.
So we're on the animation now?
Yeah.
Well, looks like this is where I came in.